Grazie Antonio, buonasera. Vorrei cominciare la mia presentazione esprimendo sia la mia gratitudine che il mio rammarico. Gratitudine verso gli organizzatori che mi hanno gentilmente invitato a partecipare a questo convegno che ha luogo in questa città così meravigliosa. Mi conforta e mi gratifica sapere che la filosofia cinese sta diventando sempre di più parte della cultura generale e posso soltanto lodare iniziative come questa che tanto contribuiscono a rendere il pensiero cinese più accessibile al grande pubblico. Detto questo, devo anche esprimere il mio rammarico e la mia frustrazione, ormai di vecchia data, dovuta al fatto che non sono mai riuscito a imparare la lingua di Dante ad un livello che mi permettesse oggi di tenere questa conferenza in italiano. Per questo vi chiedo scusa e spero che spero che non vi dispiace troppo se vi porterò nel mondo dell'antica Cina usando la lingua di Shakespeare. Molto grazie. When European thinkers, European philosophers, during the Enlightenment period, when they learned of ancient China's philosophers and their classical texts, some of these thinkers found in Chinese philosophy an alternative to some of the great questions that preoccupied their own thought systems. For instance, the late 17th century German philosopher Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, who was one of the first European philosophers to take a close interest in Chinese civilization, he learned of China through these letters that Antonio just mentioned from European Christian missionaries. Leibniz wrote a small text which was entitled De Cultu Confusi Civili. And in this text, Leibniz saw in a Chinese philosopher named Confucius a solution for the problems that he had with God. For Leibniz, the figure of Confucius represented a solution. He saw a society that was run not by the punishing eye of a god, of a transcendent god, but by a type of humanism that required no absolute or transcendent god figure. Chinese thought, so it was claimed, avoided explaining the world through metaphysical categories. Chinese rulers and the sages and advisors in their service were, so it was alleged, oriented towards practice. They focused on the here and the now. They focused on ways to improve this life rather than being too much preoccupied with the hereafter. In short, Confucian philosophy was digested as a rational and a society-oriented alternative to some of the deep-seated theological and metaphysical questions that were lingering on the minds of some European thinkers at the time. Now, needless to say, Leibniz over-idealized Chinese thought. His understanding that the Confucian concept of a heaven, that this concept was devoid of any supernatural or suprahuman powers, was exaggerated. But I want to begin by mentioning the story of the discovery of Chinese philosophy, because the whole episode was one of those key moments in history when Chinese philosophy, or the Orient writ large, when the Orient provided the ultimate other for Western thought. And these moments are not limited to the 17th and the 18th centuries, because the process in which Chinese philosophy is reduced to a number of core concepts and values that are said to offer an alternative to Western thought, that process continues up to the present day. And indeed, nowhere is this more apparent than in the ways the Chinese views of nature and the natural world are presently adopted in comparative discussions about nature, or in comparative discussions about environment or environmental history.
Can I have the next slide? I don't see. I don't get anything. If you can just give us the next slide. This thing doesn't seem to work. Oh, it does.
Thanks. The joys of technology. I show you this slide because simply to sort of show that in the last few decades, both in China and in the West, there have been several books written that use China's ancient philosophers to try and seek the origins of a sort of Chinese environmental consciousness to the past. Most of these publications emphasize organicism as the hallmark of Chinese philosophy. Now, the word sounds difficult, but it isn't. The idea is that the Chinese conceive of a harmonious continuity between human activity and the natural world, and you see, for instance, here in a volume that was produced in 2001 entitled Taoism and Ecology, which, by the way, contains some very interesting essays. But it also has a little subtitle, which I can which is in the top corner near my arrow. And it reads, Ways Within a Cosmic Landscape. The volume you see next to it is a volume that deals with Confucian philosophy and ecology. And it is subtitled The Interrelation of Heaven, Earth and Humans. Now, the point I would like to make is what is happening here is the assumption that Chinese society sought to live in harmony with nature, whereas the West sought to conquer and exploit nature. So the assumption is that Chinese philosophy and Chinese religious traditions would offer offer some desirable framework for the relationship between human beings and nature. Since the argument goes, Chinese philosophy does not insist on the domination and the utilization of nature. So the China in this kind of imagery is the China you might be familiar with from Chinese landscape paintings. Of the Taoist hermit who retreats from the world to live in harmony with nature in these mountain landscapes that you see on Chinese landscape painting. It's the China of the poet who writes verses about the flowers outside his bamboo-thatched cottage. It's the China of the perfectly balanced gardens. Or even the China of alternative medicine and acupuncture that insists on restoring balance in the body through energy flows rather than viral conquest through aggressive medication or physical intervention. In short, it's the China that insists that human beings are tiny and insignificant actors in an energetic and perpetually changing cosmos with which they seek to live in harmony. You see the tiny little man on top of the mountains. So how then did the Chinese conceive of the cosmos and the natural environments in which they lived? I'm going to divide my talk in two main parts. First, I'm going to introduce some of the basic concepts of Chinese philosophy that will hopefully help explain how the Chinese conceived of the world, of nature, of the cosmos at large, as this great continuum that emphasizes harmony, spontaneity, and the unity of living creatures with their environments. But in order to avoid reducing Chinese thought to a number of philosophical key concepts, and thereby perhaps over-idealizing it, I also want to present you with an antidote in the second part of my talk, where I will argue that Chinese views of the cosmos as represented in philosophical texts, or art, or poetry, were not necessarily reflected in the practical ways in which human beings in traditional China interacted with nature. I insist on offering this note of caution since I believe that no civilization engages with its natural environment on the basis of cosmological ideologies or intellectual paradigms only. And so therefore we must allow for the same degree of diversity and exception in the case of China as we do for Western thought. Briefly speaking, when I mention ancient China, I refer to a period that is traditionally referred to as the Warring States and early imperial period. Roughly the period between the two arrows here. So it's roughly the time that coincides with Plato, Aristotle, Alexander the Great in ancient Greece, and it ends at the time of the late Republic and the dawn of the Augustan period in Rome. It was a time when China gradually evolved from a confederacy of feudal states into the great unified empire. And that's, of course, a form which it has retained in many ways up to the present day. Why is this period important? Because this is the period where we saw the most important social, political and intellectual developments in ancient China in many ways. This is the time of the great philosophical schools. This is the time when we see literature, anecdotal and popular, emerging. And this is the time when historiography and bureaucracy originated. If one was to ask whether or not the classical Chinese language has an equivalent to a concept of nature, one would be hard-pressed to settle on one or two specific terms. Obviously, questions posed by philosophers, such as, does the Chinese language have a concept of nature, are as problematic as asking a similar question of Greek, Latin, Sanskrit or English. And as I indicated just now, discussions of nature should never be reduced to a philological discussion or only take into account key terms. In fact, one could argue that the absence of definition constitutes one of the most fundamental characteristics of classical Chinese thought. And one term frequently associated with Chinese concepts of nature is a term which pronounces in Chinese 自然, which we have in the bottom here. I don't want to teach you any Chinese, it's just to illustrate. But this term can be translated as so of itself, to be so of one's own accord. Basically, the term means spontaneity. It has nothing to do with a physical or an objectifiable reality. It describes a state of being rather than an essential quality. And so it's entirely different from the Greek notion of the physis. If we understand the Greek physis as a physical world, then the Chinese world of Ziran is just the way things are. And it includes elements that we would habitually assign to the realm of human society or culture. The majority of China's philosophers have never really been troubled by the question, what is a thing? But instead, they were interested in how things work. So this prevalence of how over what is what we see in one of the most fundamental patterns that governs the universe and all life, namely the Tao. And here you have it illustrated on. I'm sure it's a term you may have heard, the Tao. It's a very important term, everybody uses it, but it's very difficult to define what it is. The Chinese character itself is composed of two elements. The bottom part
La parte in basso
means, the bottom part means to lead,
significa condurre
and the top part
e la parte in alto
is a representation of a head.
del capo della testa.
And originally the term occurs in the context of leading a river to prevent the overflowing of the banks.
Condurre un fiume, fare in modo che il fiume non esondi.
Even the element head can mean to lead.
La testa può far pensare a questo concetto di condurre.
So what then does it mean?
Quindi cosa significa?
In its most simple explanation, the Tao is a road,
Semplice, il Dao è una strada,
a way,
una via,
a method,
un metodo,
an art.
un'arte.
It can also refer to one's teachings.
Fare riferimento degli insegnamenti.
It can even mean to explain something.
Può anche significare spiegare qualcosa.
But the most fundamental basic meaning is a way,
Il significato primario è quello di via,
or a path if you like.
un cammino, se preferite.
So even if we do not understand anything of the world around us,
Se non sappiamo nulla riguardo al mondo che ci circonda,
we can understand that it operates
possiamo comunque capire
according to a certain pattern.
agisce in base ad un andamento, un percorso specifico.
So the Tao is your roadmap.
Quindi il Dao è proprio una mappa, un cammino.
Tao, therefore, is the principle that governs the running of everything in the universe.
Che governa tutto, direttamente.
It's the spontaneous process that regulates the natural cycle of the universe.
Che regola il ciclo naturale dell'universo.
I'm going to pretend to be a Chinese philosopher now.
Adesso faccio di essere un filosofo cinese.
And if you ask me the question,
Se mi chiedete
what's the meaning of life?
qual è il significato della vita,
Admittedly, a very big question.
chiaramente è una domanda importante, una domanda.
Then the Chinese philosopher would say, the answer doesn't exist.
Uno che direbbe la risposta non esiste.
And I would ask a different question, namely, how do you live your life?
Una diversa, cioè come vivi la tua vita?
So the Tao of life is nothing more
Il Dao
than the path that you need to follow
non è nient'altro
to go through life.
che si deve seguire per attraversare
From birth to seniority,
dalla nascita all'anzianità,
and to do that in a physical and psychologically satisfying manner.
in modo soddisfacente dal punto di vista fisico e psicologico.
Now, many Chinese philosophical schools
Molte scuole di filosofia cinesi
have given different answers to the questions,
diverse risposte a queste questioni,
but they all speak of a Tao.
ma tutte parlano del Dao.
Confucian thinkers,
I filosofi confuciani,
who emphasize the importance of culture and human morality,
cultura e della moralità umana,
they speak of the Tao or the way of humans.
parlano del Dao come via dell'umanità.
Taoist philosophers, who argue that the best way to preserve life is to retreat from society,
Preservare la vita sia ritirarsi dalla società.
will use the term to describe the fundamental rhythm of the universe and the natural world.
Fondamentale del mondo naturale dell'universo.
Now, to illustrate
Quindi per
this way of thinking, it's sometimes easy or useful to go to the original natural images
farsi l'immagine
that provided the inspiration for some of these terms.
ispirazione per alcuni di questi temi.
I already mentioned water,
Ho già parlato dell'acqua.
and water is a nice example.
L'acqua è un esempio molto importante.
Western philosophy and science
La filosofia occidentale
has been obsessed with the what question.
sul cosa.
Hence, for instance, to the question, what is water?
Per esempio, in risposta alla domanda cos'è l'acqua,
The scientist amongst you may say water is dihydrogen monoxide, H2O.
diossido di idrogeno, H2O.
Alternatively, you could answer that water is something that is wet,
L'acqua è una cosa bagnata,
that flows.
che scorre,
It's something that's drinkable
che è potabile,
and something that's vital to irrigate the paddy fields.
che è essenziale per irrigare le risaie.
You could label the first answer as the Greek answer and the second one as the Chinese. In short, a thing is what it does. And the only useful thing as an intellectual you should do is to describe the path along which it travels. I use another image. When you drive on a highway and you're in a traffic jam, you're not going to ask yourself the metaphysical question, what is a highway? You're going to ask the question, how do I get quickest from A to B? That's the Tao. And you see now why the word Tao is being used in the West for all sorts of behavior, the way of warfare. You will find books that speak of the Tao of the body, the Tao of the sage, the Tao of the gentleman. I have even seen publications that speak of the Tao of business management, the Tao of sex, obviously, and the latest one, the Tao of Pooh, which is Winnie the Pooh. Okay, enough about the Tao. Now that we know that the universe that surrounds us operates following a certain Tao or roadmap, what is it composed of? Where does it come from? Chinese cosmology is remarkably different from most cosmology in Western thought, the so-called Judeo-Christian tradition. A most striking example is that the Chinese seem to have no elaborate myth of creation or an obvious creator. Chinese philosophers make little or no reference to a first cause. No Big Bang. So the idea that the world has been created out of nothing by an omnipotent power or a universal lawgiver, if you like, or a supernatural God was far less dominant in the Chinese tradition. The Chinese universe is first and foremost an organic universe. This means that the universe is conceived of as a field of energy, of natural forces, which generate each other. So human beings are not the products of a creator, but humans are seen as an integral part of nature. So while in the Judeo-Christian tradition we see a constant battle between spirit and matter, objects and attributes, in China things were viewed to behave in a particular way. Not because prior actions or impulses of other things, but because they are naturally endowed with their intrinsic behavior. Water is wet whether you're a scientist or whether you're thirsty. Right. The basic stuff out of which all things are made is known as qi, and that's the Chinese character you have on the board here. Again, like Tao, you probably have heard of qi, especially if you go for alternative medicine or you follow dietary courses and so on. I tell my students no longer to translate it and just call it qi. But that's the easy way out. Translations could be vital energy, essential energy, breath, ether. Everything is made up of qi, including inanimate matter, humans and animals, the sky, even our ideas and our emotions. Now, scholars of the Chinese language believe that the character in origin consists of the vapor, the clouds that come out of a cooking pot. This little element at the bottom here is basically the Chinese graph for a grain or a bit of rice later. And the top bit is basically the graph for a cloud or a vapor. So qi is the steam that boils out of your pots when you're cooking delightful pasta. That's all it is. Equivalents that have been used include the Greek pneuma, spiritus in Latin, prajna in Sanskrit. In short, all concepts that have soulish qualities. The breath of life. And so from that original meaning it then comes to mean, the sort of the basic stuff of everything. Now, qi manifests itself in various forms and in various forms of consistency. Heavy qi or coarse qi comes down to become the earth. Light and refined qi can become the sky, or the clouds, or the heavenly bodies. Qi comes in different degrees. It can expand or it can congeal. It can concentrate or dissipate. It can be muddy or blurred or very refined. Now, some of our philosophers argue that human beings were thought to be halfway between the two. The body was thought to be made up of rough or grosser qi, whereas the heart or the heart mind, which is the seat of the emotions, was made up of subtle or refined qi. We even have a philosopher from the Han Dynasty period, 2nd century BC. He states that coarse qi forms animals and refined qi forms human beings. So the interesting thing is that the physiological basis of animals and humans is perceived to be made up of the same basic stuff. The difference between human beings and animals is just the degree of density of qi. A different degree of refinement. We're going to leave qi behind. And if the universe is composed of qi, or vital energies, according to what mechanisms does it operate? Most thinkers in China indicate that the basic workings of the cosmos are driven by the concept of change. The only certainty we have when we look at the universe around us is that everything constantly changes shape. Right? The seasons, my body, your body, right? We are born when we are bald and we have no hair as babies, we have no teeth. Yeah. We grow adult and we are strong and physically strong. And then, as we grow older, we become babies again. Right? We lose our teeth again. We lose our hair again. And we start walking crouched over. And when we're very old, we return to the baby stage. Change. Everything changes. So that's the basic pattern in the natural world. So who were the powerful intellectuals in ancient China? These were the people who could manage to explain change. There are various texts that actually elaborate and that actually argue that all species of plants, minerals, animals mutate from each other through a process of metamorphosis. These texts also claim that the boundaries between the various animated species are very vague and indistinct. And human beings are very often simply classified as naked creatures amongst other species. That include the species with hair, feathers, scales, and so on. Now, practically speaking, in an agricultural society, being able to explain why things change at certain times in the year is very important. And that's why the Chinese agricultural calendar that tells farmers when to start sowing, harvesting, and so on. The calendar was the property of the emperor. Somebody who can draw up a calendar is somebody who has a lot of power. Because you manage everybody's time. Which is why many civilizations all have their own calendars. And one finds sometimes that with Chinese New Year, one of the most favorite gifts you get from Chinese officials is a calendar. As if to say, this is how we see the next year. So the Chinese sage is the manager of change. We move on to another concept which no doubt many of you have seen. If the cosmos exists of chi, and if the cosmos is constantly subject to change, how are these changes manifest? What is the mechanism? Now, as early as the 4th century BC, Chinese thinkers insisted that the world can be understood as a complementary system of yin and yang forces. I illustrate the concept here by means of a very well-known diagram that came to be representing the idea centuries later. And I think it's one of the most popular fake tattoos amongst teenagers. What it represents is the universe divided in two, along two planes. The vertical division goes from north to south. On the left side is yang, on the right side is yin. And each side contains within it the core of the other. There's a little bit of yin here in yang, and there's a little bit of yang. Yin and yang are best understood as two complementary symbols. Originally, yin means the shady side of a mountain, and yang is the sunny side of the mountain. And when the two modes depart from their harmonious coexistence, all sorts of imbalances such as sickness, death, natural disasters will be the result. So yin and yang are a dualism, but they do not represent things. So it's nothing more than an analytical pair of tools that allow us to describe our existence in sets of two. Light versus dark, fire, water, noise, silence, male, female. But remember, nothing is yin or yang. I'll give you an illustration. Most introductions to Chinese philosophy that have not been as carefully written as they should will say that yang is the male and yin is the female, which is incorrect. It can be, but it depends what you're talking about. For example, if we talk about physical strength, you could argue that the male is probably yang because men are physically stronger, and the female would be yin. So in relation to physical strength, you could say male is yang and yin is female. But these functions are entirely reversible. Because in relation, for example, to reproduction, women are clearly more vital than men to sustain physical life. Insemination requires less energy than incubation and nourishing. So here you would identify women as yang and men as yin. So they cross and mingle depending on the situation. Right here and now, where I'm sitting, talking to you, I am yang in the context of this environment, because I've been given the microphone and this stage to speak. And you're yin, you're listening. As soon as I finish this talk and I go home and I open the door at home and my wife says, "Where have you been yesterday evening?" I become yin and she's yang. Right? So they are complementary. It makes no sense to talk about mountains without values, about masculinity without a concept of femininity. You can't talk about a father without the concept of a mother or a son. You can't talk about a wife without a husband, heat without cold, a teacher without a disciple. And so for the Chinese, the entire cosmos is this correlative network. Everything is linked to everything else, and at least each element requires the presence of another for it to function. Now, can you see how this kind of imagery appeals to ecologists? Everything is linked to everything else. Everything is mutually complementary. but we'll return to that later.
ma ne parleremo ancora più avanti.
A last set of key terms
Un'altra serie di elementi e termini chiave
is one known as the 5 phases.
è definito come le 5 fasi.
Basically, by the time of China's first prolonged dynasty, which was the Han Dynasty, people already looked at the world as a system of spatial and temporal correspondences. And this strand of thought is known as Han Confucianism and is basically a main mechanism to explain the world until the 19th century. The idea is that in addition to natural phenomena moving along yin and yang lines, everything around us can be understood as going through 5 stages, 5 phases. Against behind the scheme was the assumption that all natural and cultural phenomena in the universe are closely related, that all elements exert a mutual influence on each other, and that every phenomenon in the world goes through a cycle. I'm giving you a table here just to give you an example. For the Chinese, there were 5 seasons because they needed seasons to correspond to 5 phases: wood, fire, earth, metal, and water. And the idea is then to match everything around us to 5. The nice example is the colors in the right column. Look at the color of the center. It's identified with yellow. Yellow is the yellow earth, is the color of the emperor, is the color of authority, is the color of central power. Now, interestingly, this scheme identifies human beings as naked creatures that are just part of, 5 phases. So instead of putting humans on an evolutionary ladder, like I suppose Aristotle and later Darwin would like, the Chinese did not conceive necessarily of the living creatures as being organized according to some evolutionary progression. The only way to define human beings is by their functional properties to others. Which is one of the reasons, for example, why in many periods of Chinese history, non-Chinese people, or barbarians, so to speak, were identified with animals. Because they were wearing animal hides, they were thought to eat food that was not cooked. In other words, there was no conceptual difference necessarily between human beings living around the center and animals. Now, the emperor, as the most exalted figure in the whole universe, is, of course, charged with maintaining the link or the balance between everything that surrounds us, or heaven, and his subjects. The emperor, as I said, is identified with yellow, and is identified with the dragon.
che si identifica anche nel drago.
And in essence, what is the Chinese dragon?
Quindi essenzialmente cos'è il drago cinese?
It's a hybrid.
È un ibrido.
It incorporates body parts of a whole lot of other animals.
Incorpora parti del corpo di altri animali.
It can swim, it can fly,
Può nuotare, volare,
it can hide, it can show itself,
può nascondersi o mostrarsi,
it can be dangerous, it can be peaceful.
può essere pericoloso o pacifico.
It is not quite human, but it is identified with the emperor.
Ma può essere identificato con l'imperatore.
So the dragon is to the animal world what the emperor is to the human world.
Il drago sta al mondo, all'universo come l'imperatore sta all'umano.
How does the emperor practically hold the things together?
Praticamente come fa?
He is meant to function as the link between humans and the natural world,
Funziona dalle funge dalle gambe,
between the cosmos and the microcosmos.
cosmo e microcosmo.
How does he do that?
E come è possibile questo per l'imperatore?
He has officials and courtiers
Veramente ha dei rappresentanti, dei cortigiani,
that interpret the skies for him,
in grado di scrutare e interpretare il cielo,
that report on strange events in the natural world,
riportano e riferiscono eventi particolari nel mondo naturale,
and that help him to explain these changes in the natural world
spiegare tecnicamente in
as signs for political events,
segni di eventi politici,
as omens.
come proprio dei segni sacri, dei simboli.
And now this principle of an emperor who is the key finger, the link between heaven and man,
L'imperatore è l'elemento chiave che lega il mondo e l'uomo.
that is a concept you see in what is probably the most quoted sentence from classical Chinese philosophy by many policymakers and politicians in China today. The unity of heaven and man.
L'unità del cielo e dell'uomo.
In Chinese, Tian Ren Hei. We won't translate that. But this is increasingly massaged into an ideology now that sustains or advocates sustainable development and an ecological balance and harmony between man and nature. So can you see how this type of thinking, that this kind of cosmological thinking insists on harmony between things rather than a separation between a subject and an object. And so it's very easy for policymakers to talk about the harmony of every member of society, with no individuals sticking out as individuals, because we're all part of that big network. But of course that's a utopia. And so now I want to give you the antidote. Because cosmology is obviously not easily linked to actual behavior. There are some clear examples where cosmological thinking has translated into practical guidelines. I already mentioned the calendar. There is no doubt that the predominant rhetoric in early Chinese philosophical text is the emphasis on harmony. But the skeptic could argue that when philosophers insist on the continuity between human society and nature, this should be interpreted as proof that the opposite may have been closer to the truth in reality. It is very doubtful, for example, that farmers in ancient China
i contadini, i cittadini comuni.
That they conceived of their natural environment as the cosmic landscape that scholars of Taoism refer to, as we did just now. Recent studies, for example, suggest that this so-called cosmic landscape in the period from the 5th century BC to the Han Dynasty already saw noticeable shifts in humidity levels and average temperature variations. For all the Taoist hermits and gardening poets of ancient China, one estimate based on written records alone suggests that during the less than 4 centuries from the early 3rd till the 6th century AD, that China was plagued by natural disasters and epidemics at a frequency rate of 21%. Roughly 1 every 4 years and 7 months. And not coincidentally, these obviously depend on political stability. So for every reference you find to the harmony between man and nature, one finds a dozen that speak of droughts, harvest failures, deforestation, insect plagues, and so on. And indeed, if one looks carefully at the historical records, we find tragic examples of environmental disasters. I'm going to give you one example, which is a very moving case. And it occurs in a text from the 2nd century BC. And it talks about a young boy who was kidnapped at the age of 4 or 5 from a poor family, sold into slavery from one master, and ultimately ends up working for a private iron industrialist near the city of Luoyang, which is in present-day Henan. So then the text says that the boy was clearing a hillside of its trees to provide charcoal for the iron furnaces. And one night, while he and his fellow slaves were sleeping, the entire mountainside collapsed, burying over 100 men and boys alive. So these are records that we also find. The point I want to make is that we need to be aware that in reality, the Chinese state has consistently attempted to harbor natural resources and to mold nature. It has done so, for instance, by mobilizing populations for collective labor projects. The Great Wall is a good example. Often on a vast scale, with a high degree of compulsion. But the Chinese state has also tried to assist on the primacy of the collective over the individual by overriding local concerns in the name of supposedly broader interests of the empire. Everybody today talks about the potential for environmental disaster in China, given its economic boom. It would not be correct to associate environmental decay in China only with the recent present. For example, with the Maoist campaigns to conquer nature the last century, or the rapid economic growth and depletion of natural resources in present-day China. The American anthropologist Robert Weller offers a nice correction when he reminds us that the rice paddy, for instance, is in essence a man-made environment. Huge building projects such as the Great Wall or the Grand Canal, which was a canal that by the 6th century AD already measured 1,776 kilometers, they are more than comparable in terms of environmental impact to some of the more unfortunate experiments such as the Three Gorges Dam. Here we are. This is the famous Three Gorges Dam, which led to the unsettling of 1 million, communities. On the right, you see a picture and a map of the Grand Canal, which links present-day Beijing all the way with Hangzhou. Started in the 6th century, 1,776 kilometers long. I'm merely giving you these examples to suggest that philosophers sometimes would do well to step off their cosmic horse and delve into the reality of historical and material records. And nevertheless, when we talk of the perception of nature across civilizations, one thing we must always acknowledge is that we're never talking about nature itself. We're always talking about perceptions of nature. And so I'm going to end this lecture with an example of the immense power and symbolism carried by the natural world in traditional China. In ancient China, a geographic territory was viewed as a social and biological unit. That means that people believed that there was a physical congruence, similarity between the soil and the people who lived on the soil. For example, people who live in warm climates were thought to have a temperate character, right? People's skin color was associated with the region in which they live, and so on. There were some authors that even said that people speak the languages of the animals that share their habitat. And so only the exotic or most powerful among the species were believed to be able to transcend their territorial boundaries, to leave their normal habitat. And traditionally, Chinese rulers asserted their social, political, and economic power by traveling the lands, by exchanging tributary goods with the neighboring people, and by hunting and ritually consuming game animals or gathering plants as an act of conquest. So the Chinese ruler traveled to the outskirts of the empire, and at the same time, when his subjects wanted to show wished to symbolically acknowledge his power, they would travel to the capital and bring natural products, memorabilia, strange plants, exotic animals. There is a nice example of the first giraffe coming from Mombasa during the Ming Dynasty. And so all these creatures were gathered in imperial parks, in the same way as the natural world of the British Empire was recreated in Victorian zoos. Or you could see how in international foreign relationships with China, the panda bear has a very specific symbolical function. And so in these huge parks, the emperor would move around, he would hunt strange creatures, he would examine exotic fauna and flora as if he was traveling through his empire. Now, one of the most famous parks was known as the Shang Lin Park, which you see here in a much later representation by a painter. This was the park of the Han Emperor Wu Di. And that's the park that is described in great details in poems. And these poems do nothing else than summarize very detailed lists of rocks, plants, animals, and so on. But all these images should also teach us that we should de-romanticize nature and the wilds. Natural landmarks such as forests, marshes, rivers, and ponds in ancient China, they were conceived of as rightfully owned by the ruler or the court, or at least they were used to provide the private expenses for the ruler. One text even says that the profits of the mountains and the seas and the product of the broad marshes are the stored wealth of the empire. In other words, the romantic nature, the mountains of your mountain landscapes, they all belong to the treasury. And of course, the idea that the wilds should be linked to the treasury is not insignificant, because it suggests that references to natural landmarks as the ultimate refuge from culture, that these same places are also associated with wealth, with the powerful, with goods, and as in Europe, with entertainment of those who are in power. So the early Chinese leave us with at least two distinct images of the wilds and nature. You have a nature as a world of harmony, of refuge, of reflection, of hermitage, of distance to society, but equally also nature as the private property of those in power, as a commodified and exploited sphere associated with the few and the privileged, as an exclusive asset allowing the generation of wealth through different means than agriculture or craft. Now, given that the interpretation and the manipulation of the natural world was so intimately linked with power, it is therefore not surprising that the Chinese texts are full of anecdotes that illustrate how the natural world responds in return to good human behavior. Let me end today's lecture with an example that might tempt anyone in need of an edifying example from China's past about sustainable development. Or maybe people in the European Union who think about European fishing policies. In the late 1st century BC, there was a local official who was reporting that in the past, in his commandery, in his province, that the fish stocks would not show themselves whenever additional taxes were placed on seafood. The village elders claimed that when the emperor imposed a government monopoly on sea products, the fish remained hidden deep in the sea. Later, however, when permission for free fishing was given again to the people, the fish came out again, as if they presented themselves ready to be caught. That's the unity of man and nature in one way. But now that we've traveled from cosmic theory to self-sacrificing fish, it's time to end. I thank you for listening to me.